in 2007. And the tabloid press was covered in pictures like this. But actually, the real evidence tells, over the slightly longer term, a different story about teenage pregnancy. And these are many countries around the world and trends in teenage fertility. You don't have to read all the different countries. The general point that you can get at a glance is that the lighter bars for 1970 reflect substantially higher teenage pregnancy rates than the darker bars for 1998. So almost everywhere in the world, the trend in teenage pregnancy is downwards, not upwards, despite one or two recent statistics. Britain, of course, there is a lot of variation here, and some of the highest teenage pregnancy rates are, not surprisingly, in the United States, that bar there, the United Kingdom, that bar there, by contrast with Japan, very, very low rates down here, and Ireland, oddly, the only one in this series which shows an increase in teenage pregnancy rates over that period of time. So culture, in this case, appears to be counter-evolutionary. On the one hand, there's an evolutionary force for teenage pregnancy. On the other hand, there's a rather strong cultural force which is encouraging women to have fewer children. Now, continuing the pregnancy theme and thinking again about what's happening in developing countries, one of the reasons that young children die is through malaria. And malaria, therefore, in pregnancy, which is an important cause of illness and death, and premature birth and the death of very young children, under these circumstances, that system, if you like, is a very good system in which to look for evolution in action. And what's been found and published within the last few months is that a variant of this gene called FTL1 is a gene carried by the fetus which actually protects the fetus against malaria in the womb. And there are two fascinating things about this. One is that the mechanism of protection is through maternal immunity. So the baby has the gene, but the baby stimulates the mother to produce the right immune response that kills the malaria parasite. So that's the first interesting fact. The second interesting fact is that the evidence is such that in this particular study, the researchers could say with some confidence that this is not something that happened thousands of years ago, but this is happening right now in Tanzania as a result of malaria in pregnancy. Now, AIDS, of course, around the world is one of the other potentially important forces in evolution. Because as I've already said, I showed you the statistics from Zimbabwe, where a lot of people are dying at reproductive age. And those are the circumstances under which we'd expect fairly strong selection. And there's a gene called CCR5, which is associated with protection against the HIV virus. And rather interestingly, this gene is at the moment common in Europe, and particularly Northern Europe. It probably originated in southern Scandinavia, and this is the way it's spread across Europe at the moment, where red is higher frequency, blue is lower frequency. But this gene is relatively low in Africa and Asia. And it's relatively low, in other words, in the parts of the world where HIV is also, at the moment, most frequent, not least frequent. And so the question posed by this study is, why is this gene, which protects people against HIV, actually common in Europe at the moment? And the answer is only a matter of speculation at the moment, but the suggestion is that it also protects people against other kinds of disease that have been common, such as plague and such as smallpox. And the most likely one of those two is probably smallpox. But that gene is there, it's available, and it's likely to be under strong selection pressure. But interestingly, I've mentioned AIDS and I've mentioned malaria, and there are possibly antagonistic evolutionary processes going on with respect to AIDS and with respect to malaria. What's been known for a long time with respect to malaria in Africa is that the Duffy blood type is protective against the form of malaria that's caused by Plasmodium vivax. The main killer is Plasmodium falciparum, but Plasmodium vivax is rather rare in Africa because people are protected by being Duffy negative. A recent study has found, unfortunately, that people who are Duffy negative, whilst they're protected against malaria, are also apparently more susceptible to HIV infection. So you have one genetic process causing a characteristic in the human population that protects people against malaria but makes them more susceptible to HIV. And we'll have to see how those forces balance out. I'm going to say a couple of words about other kinds of evolutionary process, because everything I've said so far has been about natural selection, which started with a plate of bacteria I showed you right at the start of this talk. And one of the other potentially important processes is sexual selection. That is where individuals choose who they want to mate with on the basis of their characteristics, where those characteristics are determined by the genes that they're carrying. And typically what that means is that people choose to mate with other people who are more like them, and that's called assortative mating. And when you have very strong assortative mating in a population, that is a process that can force gene combinations through a population to fixation. Now, it's been argued by Steve Jones, among others, that we now live in a very large population where people choose their partners, their mates, cross-culturally, cross-nationally, cross-ethnically, and so on. So there's a lot of outbreeding going on in the population as well, not inbreeding. But there are, of course, also mechanisms by which sexual selection can take place, and the internet is probably the best known of them. This was actually not an internet example, this is a billboard, and I presume Helen put this up in 2003, that's what it seems to say behind the bus stop there, and she had very precise requirements. I can only hope that Helen, now we're in 2009, has actually found the man of her choice with somebody who satisfied all of those particular bullet points. This is sexual selection in action, potentially in a very large population. The other kind of process, there are a number of other processes, but one that I'll comment on because the significance of it is being discussed a lot at the moment, is epigenetics, as distinct from genetics. Now, genetic variation is when you actually change the DNA that you're made of. Epigenetics is where you can change what the DNA does, but not by changing the code, but by modifying the chemical structure around the outside. And that's what the epi means, on top of the genes that we've already got. And one of the most intriguing examples comes from people who were born in the Netherlands in the harsh winter of 1944-1945, which was called the Hongerwinter in Dutch. And by some estimates, around about 20,000 people died of hunger during the course of that winter. But among the people who didn't die, starvation was frequent. And those people who are alive today who were fetuses, that is, they were in the womb during the course of that winter, have an epigenetic modification, a methylation, as it's called, of their DNA. And that methylation is known to be associated with certain diseases like diabetes and certain forms of cancer, like colorectal cancer. And those people have that genetic modification, and it's lasted for 60 years, and it's potentially passable on to the next generation. So it's a hereditary mechanism that's caused by an environmental phenomenon, a harsh environmental phenomenon. But we mustn't make the mistake of looking at all changes in human populations as being potentially genetic changes. And here's a very nice example that probably isn't a genetic change, at least in the views of, the proof is not there, but in the views of those people who are expert in the development of human teeth. This is the common view. Impacted molars, problem wisdom teeth, malocclusion as it's called, is very common these days in human population, but it didn't used to be so common. The reason, possibly, this is how the argument goes, is that we've changed what we eat over the past few thousand years. We now eat softer food, and the eating of that softer food leads to a different jaw development and indeed a different skull development. And we now, essentially, as a result of eating that softer food from birth, have 32 teeth, as one expert put it, in a size 28 mouth. That means there isn't room for wisdom teeth at the back, and that's a common reason why people have to have their wisdom teeth removed. The strong view is that that's not genetic, that's a cultural and an environmental change. It's based on what we eat. It's not a genetic change in the human population. So in the last few moments of what I'm going to say, I want to consider what's going to happen from now and into the future. Well, I've already pointed out that it's not true what Jones and others have said about survival to reproductive age being uniformly high around the world and fertility being even around the world. It's actually not true. And it may not be true into the future either. The last lecture I gave here was about climate change, and this is one of the pictures that I showed during the course of that lecture. We are likely to see